In this video, I discuss the second of our three inquiries. What impacts is climate change already having and is predicted to have on society? I have divided this inquiry into 10 smaller topics. Extreme weather events seem the right way to start. It is through triggering extreme weather events that climate impacts all these other things, on humanity's ability to grow enough food, have adequate supplies of clean water, and so on. In many places, climate change will mean higher temperatures, more heat waves, more frequent and longer drought, larger and more intense wildfires. In other places, it will mean heavier rainfall and flooding. Storm events, such as hurricanes, will become more powerful. Let's consider just a few of these events and the trouble they will cause. Climate change has already raised temperatures. As this map from NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, shows, temperatures during the most recent 30 years have been significantly higher than the 20th century average. Hot days can persist, turning into heat waves, most often in the darker colored parts of this map. In coming decades, even more hot days are predicted. This map shows the estimate of the number of days that various parts of the U.S. can expect temperatures to go above 100 degrees by the year 2100 if greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase unabated. This NOAA map shows changes in rainfall, again comparing the past 30 years to the 20th century average. Most of the nation east of the Rockies has seen more rain, the Southwest and the West significantly less. In recent years, drought conditions out west have worsened. Look at this map. In 2021, we are seeing record dry conditions in the Southwest. With climate change, drought is predicted to become the new normal, especially in the Southwest and parts of the South. Hotter, drier conditions have already triggered increased wildfire in the American West. Fire season is lasting longer. There are more fires, and they are larger and more ferocious. Here is fire in Los Angeles, in Ventura, California. And it's not just California, not just the American West. Climate-driven heat and drought is causing more massive wildfires elsewhere, too. This was Australia last year. Some places in Australia, people had to flee to the shore to escape the fire. As I do this recording in June of 2021, massive wildfires are burning in Brazil, in the Amazon, and in Siberia. In other places, the problem is too much water. In 2019, floods devastated parts of the Midwest. Let's consider just one other example of extreme weather. Climate change is making the oceans warmer. Warm water is the engine that drives hurricanes. The warmer the ocean, the more powerful the hurricane. Hurricane season starts earlier, lasts longer, brings more powerful and more damaging hurricanes. This was the Jersey Shore after Hurricane Sandy hit the New York City region in 2012. And this was the city of Houston after Hurricane Harvey struck in 2017. Damaging storms, heat and drought here, too much rain and flooding there. Extreme weather events disrupt people's lives. They can destroy crops. They can make local water supplies undrinkable. They can have huge economic impacts. Next, we should consider climate impacts on food and on water, two of the most basic needs of the human body. First, food. Hunger is already a huge issue today. There are almost 8 billion people alive today. About a billion are already having trouble getting enough to eat. Climate change raises temperatures, and it changes the amount and the timing of rainfall. Such changes can decrease agricultural yields. And ocean catch today accounts for a significant portion of the protein people consume. The world's fisheries will be affected as ocean waters get warmer and more acidic. Therefore, climate change is predicted to increase food insecurity, that is, hunger, in some of the poorest, most densely populated regions of the globe: East Asia, South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, parts of Latin and Central America. The situation is much the same when we look at people's access to adequate supplies of safe, clean water. Today, more than 1 billion people struggle to get enough water each day. Water for drinking, water for cooking, water for washing. Climate change is predicted to make that situation far worse, again with the greatest impacts to be seen in China, India, the Middle East, the northern tier of Africa. Moving on, public health researchers agree that climate change will have serious impacts on health and illness. As this article in the New England Journal of Medicine tells us, the impacts we have already discussed, extreme weather events, exposure to heat stress, hunger, issues with access to clean water, are all likely to make people sicker. In June of 2019, over 70 medical and public health organizations declared that climate change is, quote, the greatest public health challenge of the 21st century. Next, what can we say about climate change's likely impacts on the American economy, on the world's economy? This is a huge question, and the answer is far from certain, in part because there are so many ways that climate change could damage a nation's economy, the whole world's economy. To begin to understand the potential scale of the economic impact, let's think about just one example: sea level rise. Here, according to NOAA, is what America's coastlines will look like if sea levels rise by 2 feet. Look at this list. 5 out of our 10 biggest cities, some of our most important cities, New York, Washington, D.C., some of our most iconic cities, Boston, New Orleans, San Francisco, are all located on one of the coasts. How much will it cost to save these cities from sea level rise, to build massive seawalls, or to build giant systems of pumps? Then, if sea levels rise to the point that they overwhelm those walls and pumps, how much will it cost to relocate a dozen big coastal cities, actually move whole cities further inland, move the housing and office buildings, the urban infrastructure, the industry, move 100 million people? Add to that some other obvious costs: the cost of adapting agriculture to changing conditions, the cost of damage due to more frequent and more powerful storms. And those are only some of the ways climate change will hurt the economy. I am sure that with a little more thought, we would have no problem coming up with more big-ticket items to add to that list. There have been some attempts to estimate the total economic damage. The numbers are really astronomical. This paper, published in the journal Nature Climate Change, predicts, for the U.S., hundreds of billions of dollars every year. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came up with this estimate for the world as a whole: tens of trillions of dollars. Swiss Re is one of the largest reinsurance firms on Earth. Its institute just published this report, estimating future economic impacts of climate change. Swiss Re predicts that by the year 2050, the world's economy is likely to be 11 to 14% smaller than it would have been if climate change had not been happening. There are certain to be political impacts too. Let's consider just some examples. Chronic food shortages often lead to demonstrations, street protests. Such protests can turn violent. If such outbursts of street-level disorder persist, if they last for, say, weeks, they can call into question the legitimacy of the government, undermine its credibility, destabilize it. Many of the world's governments are either incompetent or corrupt, sometimes both. Realistically, one can have little confidence that they will respond effectively when conditions worsen. It is far more likely that they will fail, setting off levels of disillusionment and levels of discontent that can only further destabilize a nation's political system. And hunger is only one of the ways that climate change can have powerful effects on a nation's political system. Scarcity of any kind can trigger civil conflict. A government slow to respond to natural disasters. Consider this statement in a report written by 11 retired admirals and generals who serve on the board of CNA, the Center for Naval Analyses. Climate change will seriously exacerbate already marginal living standards in many Asian, African, and Middle Eastern nations, causing widespread political instability, fostering the conditions for internal conflicts. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. Political impacts can easily spread from poorer to wealthier countries. When masses of people migrate, driven by crisis in their part of the world, that can trigger trouble elsewhere, in the nations they are trying to reach. Millions of people, tens of millions of people, are already on the move today. They are migrating from Africa and the Middle East to Europe, from South and Central America to the US. Most people very much prefer to stay in the community where they grew up, but they are driven to migrate because of unbearable local conditions: poverty, hunger, violence. Climate change is projected to worsen many of the conditions that drive migration, triggering vast increases in the number of people on the move, from several hundred million today to possibly billions in future decades. Current levels of migration have already caused political upheaval in Europe and in the US. We are seeing the rise of nationalism, racism, xenophobia. We see here an anti-immigrant street demonstration in France, and a similar demonstration in Austria. Anti-immigrant vigilantes and ships patrol the Mediterranean. Some of those anti-immigrant demonstrations begin to look uncomfortably like neo-fascist thugs taking over the streets of Europe. As this headline says, climate impacts are already driving some of the migration we are seeing at the southern US border. Imagine the political impact in Europe, in the United States, if the number of migrants grows by, let's say, a factor of 10. I need to pause here to make an important point. These impacts will not just be happening one at a time. They will be happening all at the same time, and one impact can trigger others in a cascade of consequences. As I have already pointed out, for example, extreme weather events can disrupt agriculture, destroy crops, decrease food supplies. And, as we have already seen, food shortages increase hunger, triggering protest and political instability. Water shortages can also cause political conflict, and not just in poor, underdeveloped nations. Much of the American West, cities, states, agriculture, have depended on allocations of Colorado River water. Years of conflict, negotiations, and compacts have divided the river's waters among these different interests. But now, extreme drought in the region has cut the amount of water flowing down the Colorado. Drought has drastically decreased snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Hoover Dam was built to capture the waters of the Colorado River, store it in Lake Mead until it could be divided among various users. Climate change, drought, decreased snowpack, Lake Mead is now at a historical low, which means that we are about to see a new round of political conflict among the states, the cities, the ag interests that depend on the Colorado River. Further north in the state of Oregon, drought has shrunk the Klamath River, and that has triggered conflict between farmers, Native Americans, and environmentalists over their allocations of Klamath River water. Again, the point I'm making is that as climate change worsens, we will not be experiencing one impact here, another there. We will be experiencing all these impacts all at the same time, and they will be interacting, triggering each other, fueling each other. Sociology has long been committed to studying the many forms of inequality in society. When we examine the impacts of climate change, we must always keep in mind that those impacts are already hitting and will increasingly hit unequally. The world's nations will experience very different levels of impact. Hunger will increase way more in some parts of the world than in others, as we have already seen. People living in some regions will have much greater trouble having access to adequate supplies of clean water, again, as we have already seen. As noted earlier, the Swiss Re Institute has published estimates of the future economic impacts of climate change. It too shows large differences among the world's nations. Swiss Re's study shows that the economies of the wealthier, more developed nations of Europe and North America are projected to be 7 to 8% smaller by 2050 than they would have been if climate change had not been happening. That's significant, but far less than what poorer, less developed nations would be losing. As this table shows, the economies of the Middle East and Africa will have gotten smaller by 14 to 21.5%. Elsewhere in the report, we learn that China's economy would be 15 to 18% smaller, India's 17 to 27%. So, the same regions, the same nations would have greater food insecurity, greater water insecurity, would be taking a larger economic hit. Finally, Oxfam, the humanitarian NGO, has made an effort to look at all predicted climate impacts together. Its findings agree with those other studies. Overall, East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, parts of South and Central America are going to be experiencing the greatest impacts. Impacts will hit unequally in the United States as well. The Southwest and the South will have more very hot days than other regions in the continental U.S. The Southwest, parts of Texas and the Central Plains will have bigger problems with supplies of water. Coastal areas will see much more flooding. Eventually, large areas will just be underwater, submerged, gone. I turn now to another dimension of inequality in climate impacts, differential impacts by social class and by race and ethnicity. Years of research on environmental inequalities has shown that poor communities and communities of color have been systematically, disproportionately affected by pollution, by exposure to toxic hazardous chemicals from waste disposal sites, from factories, and so on. Why would these persistent patterns of inequality carry over into the impacts of climate change? A clue is provided by research that tried to understand why poor people and people of color are differentially affected by natural disasters such as hurricanes, floods, and fires. The answer was that it had to do with differential vulnerability, a consequence of differential resources. People with greater resources can better avoid danger before an event, can cope better during the event, and can recover faster and more fully after the event is over. That's why poor people are more vulnerable to flood, more vulnerable to wildfires. Climate change is predicted to generate more extreme events, more and bigger natural disasters. It seems certain that the impacts of such events will fall more heavily on those who are the most vulnerable, the poor, and on racial and ethnic minorities. And the same logic holds for other climate impacts too: food insecurity, lack of access to clean water, and so on. In fact, today we are already seeing new kinds of environmental inequalities, ones that are caused by climate change. In cities, what's known as the heat island effect is more intense in minority neighborhoods. In coastal areas with high minority numbers, sea levels are rising faster. Natural disasters cause more damage in poor communities of color. Inequalities and climate impacts will continue to get more extreme as temperatures rise. But if temperatures go even higher, say to something on the order of 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, we risk triggering a collective situation that goes beyond unequal differential impacts to a time of truly catastrophic impacts. This is what people fear when they say that climate change could be an existential threat. There is much to say here and incredibly hard to hear it, hard to think about it, but think about it we must. Let's try to understand it in this way. In the Paris Accords of 2015, the world's nations agreed to try to keep temperature increases to, quote, well below 2 degrees centigrade. In 2019, the IPCC issued a special report in which it said 2 degrees is too much. That would cause too much damage. That the goal should be no more than 1.5 degrees. The World Resources Institute tells us what it would take to meet that 1.5 degree target. We would need to significantly reduce CO2 emissions by 2030 and get to near zero emissions by 2050. But, in fact, except for a small reduction in 2020 due to the pandemic, emissions are still rising. The International Energy Agency projects that the world will continue to burn more fossil fuel, at least through 2040. So, CO2 emissions will continue to rise. If that prediction holds true, what is going to happen? This paper, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, provides us with one, quite scary, answer. Bear with me now. We are going to explain the paper's conclusions using this illustration. For over 100,000 years, the Earth has been going through this cycle, alternating between glacial and interglacial periods, ice ages with warmer times between them. Humanity's great successes, agriculture, cities, civilizations, have all occurred during the current interglacial. The climate wet, but not too wet, warm, but not too warm, stable, pleasant. Let me put it this way. When astronomers look for habitable exoplanets, they look for Earth-like planets in their sun's so-called Goldilocks zone. Perhaps then we can say that Homo sapiens has thrived in the time that the Earth had a Goldilocks climate. But now the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is in the process of jolting the Earth out of that cycle and into a climate regime that the authors call hothouse Earth. That's a climate regime the Earth has not seen in at least 3 million years, a regime that no human being has ever experienced. Another paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences explains some of what that will mean. The paper looks at which parts of the globe human beings have preferred to live in during the life of our species. They find that for thousands of years, humans have concentrated in a surprisingly narrow subset of Earth's available climates, characterized by mean annual temperatures of around 13 degrees centigrade. Climate change modeling predicts that large parts of that historically preferred habitat will get too hot for human bodies. Large parts of our preferred habitat will be unlivable. What will that look like? This map shows the parts of the world that are too hot for people now. Those are the small black areas. And the map shows the parts that will be too hot by 2070 if we continue to burn fossil fuels at the current rate. Those are the cross-hatched areas. As the paper states, somewhere between 1 and 3 billion people will be living in those areas by 2070. Those people will be exposed to mean annual temperatures warmer than nearly anywhere today on Earth. What's going to happen to them? Where will they go on a hothouse Earth? I would like to point out, though, that the authors of this paper do not want to leave the reader completely hopeless. According to them, there is no going back now to that glacial interglacial cycle that served us so well. But it is still possible, with great concerted effort, to reach a different future, a livable, survivable condition that they call stabilized Earth. That concludes my discussion of the second component of the sociology of climate change. To learn about the third component, societal responses, please go on to the final video in this series.